You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies for about 4 bits each. My brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Mahfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas. And here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello and welcome to another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. I'm your host, Ray Gerard, and this is the program that asks, hey, what if St. Paul were alive today? Actually here and still able to write a letter and could write a letter to America. What would that letter say? Wouldn't it be amazing if that could actually happen? What would he tell us? What, in fact, would he tell us? If he was looking at what was going on in our country today, what would he think we'd want to hear? Well, if you have tuned into this podcast, you're going to hear exactly what St. Paul would write. Because what he wrote 2,000 years ago is still today. And is still something that he would be wanting to tell us today. So, with that in mind, each week we take a look at a given letter from St. Paul, and we compare it to something that we're doing in our country, compare it to a current social topic, current item in the news, and ask, well, is what St. Paul is suggesting to us what we are doing? Or are we doing something different? And if, in fact, we're doing something different, who's right? Are we right, or is it St. Paul? Well, what are we going to talk about this week? Well, this week, we're going to talk about something that hasn't made a lot of news. You may not have heard, probably not have heard about it at all. There is an organization called the International Society for Stem Cell Research, and they came out with a new set of guidelines for stem cell research. Okay. So that's of interest to people in the scientific community, in the biological field, but to who else? Why would it be important? Well, one interesting thing is they just came out with a new set of guidelines, that's true, but they just put out a set of guidelines in 2016. They needed to revamp their guidelines in only 5 years. Why? You know, we ask, hey, wouldn't St. Paul write to us in America today the same thing he wrote to people 2,000 years ago? Well, not if he was affiliated with the International Society for Stem Cell Research, because what they consider to be important truth has changed in only 5 years. We're going to talk about that and what they decided it needs to be so different. But before we do that, we're going to give you a letter from St. Paul. And it is this. I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel preached by me is not of human origin, for I did not receive it from a human being, nor was I taught it, but it came through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you heard of my former way of life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. But when God, who from my mother's womb had set me apart and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might proclaim him to the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult flesh and blood, Rather, I went into Arabia. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to confer with Cephas and remained with him for 15 days. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was unknown personally to the churches. They only kept hearing that the one who once was persecuting us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. So they glorify God because of me. Now, what is there in this particular letter that calls us now to read it tonight? Well, a couple of things. First off, it's an unabashed, unconditional, complete, utter, absolute proclamation of Jesus Christ, the reality of Christ. So that message in and of itself, that there is a God and that he loves us and he's willing to sacrifice for us, that message in and of itself is always, always, always hugely important. But what else does he say? He says that this mission that he had, even though he was on a completely different track, this mission that he had of proclaiming Christ to the Gentiles was something that was known by God for him, known as his life's purpose from the womb, before he was even born. Before he was even born, God had a design for him. And even though he went in a completely opposite direction, he eventually changed. And when he changed, he affected so many people. All these people in Syria and Cilicia were amazed. How did this turnabout happen? This guy who was trying to kill us, he's now preaching this gospel that we believe in to us. How did that ever come about? And could it ever come about except for the fact that there maybe was some plan for which he was destined? And it was from the womb, from the very, very beginning. When did Paul's life start for that reason? I mean, when did his real existence start? When he was born? Maybe before? The International Society for Stem Cell Research had put out a set of guidelines on stem cell research back in 2016. So what is stem cell research? Well, basically you take a small, like a human, it's a human, I think technical definition of an embryo is once it gets implanted in a womb, and before then I believe it's just simply a zygote, but you've got a fertilized egg. You've got a sperm and an egg, and the egg is fertilized by the sperm, and you have the very beginning of the makings of a human person. And in 2016, this International Center for Stem Cell Research wrote that when you take these zygotes and then you use them for experiments, and you can use them for experiments. They wrote that, there's a great deal of benefit that can come from studying these things. So they're studied in the laboratory, they're studied in the test tube, they're kept outside of a womb, and experiments are done on them. But that after 14 days, according to the standard back in 2016, after 14 days, they had to be destroyed. Well, why was that? Well, because at that point, after 14 days, you had the beginnings that the zygote would start to form a spinal cord and a nervous system. And that apparently was the benchmark, and that was the dividing line. And after that point in time, you'd have to get rid of the zygote. You couldn't continue to do experiments on it because then it was actually becoming something of a human person. I mean, is that what they said? Is that what they meant? Well, but of course, what is the alternative conclusion? I mean, if a zygote starts to become an actual human as early as 14 days, then obviously you've got a problem if you're going to continue to experiment on that person, because otherwise, why not experiment on live people, adult people? What's the difference? But if, in fact, it's not really a human person at this point, then what's to stop you from going past 14 days? Why not go to 28 days? Why not to go to 3 months? Why not to do... there's an illogic involved in it. Why stop at 14 days? This, if it starts to become a human, then you're admitting that there's a problem here. And if that problem exists, then doesn't it exist? If it exists at 14 days, doesn't it exist at 13 days, 12 days, 11 days? How do we decide? What is the truth here? How do we decide what's real, what's not? Do we just throw darts at a board and just come up with this stuff? Well, apparently so, because now the same institute, barely 5 years later, has rescinded this 14-day rule. Now, it's interesting. In the 2016 report, as well as in the 2021 one, they start out by saying that the primary societal mission of basic biomedical research and its clinical translation is to alleviate and prevent human suffering. Well, that seems inconsistent right there. If you admit that there's something human about the zygote at 14 days, then how are you alleviating human suffering? Oh, I get it. It's because you're going to start the nervous system at 14 days. So if the nervous, then it might feel pain after that in some form or another. So that's why we got to keep it to 14 days. Okay, at least that makes some logical sense. But we have another problem. Because while that was the truth in 2016, in 2021, we can go to 28 days and beyond. So if the primary mission is to alleviate human suffering, and in fact, the nervous system starts to form, I don't know, are you violating your primary mission? I mean, we try to look at these writings from St. Paul over and over and over again and say, are they consistent? Do they stand the test of time? Are they fleeting? Are they transitory? Are they subject to the whims of whoever, at any place or time wants to change them? And the idea is basically, no. There are certain truths that St. Paul talks about that cannot be changed. They are true. There is such a thing as truth. The problem that we have with organizations like this one, the International Society for Stem Cell Research, there is no truth. There's the truth from today, and then there's the truth of tomorrow. That's not truth. It's just whatever we want. In both reports, it also says that the ISSCR's guidelines build on a set of widely shared ethical principles. Widely shared, at least, maybe in certain geographic areas, but certainly not from year to year. In science, research, and human subjects in medicine. And they cite, for example, the Nuremberg Code from 1949. Well, isn't that interesting? A set of widely shared principles. They are grounded in something firm. There's an agreement. There's a consensus. These are these widely shared principles of what's ethical, what's not. There's a firm foundation here. Oh, but yeah, it changes 5 years later. It also says in both reports, physicians and physician researchers owe their primary duty to the patient and or research subject. They must never unduly place vulnerable patients at risk. Clinical testing should never allow promise for future patients to override the welfare of current research subjects. This is the International Society for Stem Cell Research. Well, by definition, everything they do is allowing the promise for future patients to override the welfare of the subjects in the labs that they have, these bare makings, these beginnings of human persons. Those those are something. They have to be something. If that's an actual person, at least in some preliminary sense or in a complete sense, and the reason you're doing research on them is to supposedly alleviate, medical suffering for other people in the future, then you're doing the very thing you say you're not supposed to be doing. Oh, but it's okay because these little 14-day-old, zygotes, they're not really human persons. Oh, yeah, but then why are we concerned about, going past 14 days or not going past 14 days? Why even start with this 14-day idea in the first place? If they're not humans, then there's nothing to worry about. I'm getting dizzy. Just, look, every statement that they have, they seem to contradict. It is, in fact, it's hard to keep up with. Let's see. It's also interesting. When individuals lack capacity to give consent, surrogate consent should be obtained, and human subjects should be stringently protected from non-therapeutic procedures that involve greater than minor increase over minimal risk. So if you're getting consent from a surrogate, you got to stringently protect your test subjects from anything more than minimal risk. Well, these 14-day-old zygotes, you kill them. After 14, the 14-day rule is a nice rule. You could only experiment up till 14 days on them because there's something precious about them that begins to exist at 14 days. So what do you do at the 14-day period? Because you can't experiment on them anymore because that would be immoral. You destroy them. I mean, you can't experiment on them, but you can destroy them because we have concern of some sort because they've got some kind of value that we can't just do whatever we want, but we can destroy them. Again, the number of inconsistencies, it just doesn't end. So, anyways, those were some of the the prefatory statements in the 2016 report. And then when I referred to by the way, the 14-day rule was under a category of prohibited research activities, and it said that the permit at 14 days, what gets formed then is the primitive streak. They call it the primitive streak when you begin to form the nervous system and the spine. Also, another prohibited activity, research in which animal chimeras, some kind of mixture of two various organisms, some kind of a hybrid. Research in which animal chimeras incorporating human cells with the potential to form human gametes are bred to each other. So, to some extent, implanting human tissue, human elements into animals, that also is prohibited. That's a problem. And yet it just, with the potential to form human gametes, so are bred to each other. So I think what they're referring to is some kind of actual breeding as opposed to just implanting human elements into animals for some kind of research purposes or something short of actually breeding some kind of new organism. I think that's what they're saying. But even again, that's a problem. If some kind of animal research with human tissue is allowed, then why stop at why stop short of why stop at breeding? Why not do breeding? Why not make some kind of Frankensteinian kind of monster? Just combining this and that. What's the problem? What's the difference? Either there are principles that are based in some kind of reality, that there's something real, something true, something authentic that we need to try to be aware of, or there isn't. And this playing games with these rules, now you can do it, now you can't, it just suggests that what you are doing is wrong. I mean, if you have to change the rules to make it right, then chances are you're doing something wrong. Or at least you run a very good risk of it. Or that you don't really know what you're doing. One of those has to apply. Now the interesting thing is this 14-day rule has become very widely accepted. Once it was introduced, it was just followed pretty much everywhere, even in countries like the United States that don't have any law with regard to it. There are a couple of researchers that here in the States, there were two studies recently that were able to go beyond the 14-day rule. The problem with the 14-day rule was that there really was no problem. You didn't have to abide by it because you couldn't get a zygote to last beyond 14 days. They couldn't make it live that long unless it was implanted in a woman. You couldn't grow a culture, so to speak, in the lab longer than that. But recently in the UK and then in the United States, there were some test subjects that went up to 12 and 13 days. And the only reason that they stopped was because they could have gone longer than 14, but the reason that they stopped is because in the UK, they had a law against it. In the United States, the researchers just voluntarily stopped because the 14-day rule was just widely accepted by the scientific community. That was the moral, that was the normal thing to do. In countries like Austria, Germany, Italy, Russia, and Turkey, you cannot perform research on human embryos. You can't. So 14 days, whatever, you can't. In other countries like Canada, China, India, Japan, Spain, and the United Kingdom, the 14-day rule is applied. As a matter of fact, in 1979 in the United States, the 14-day rule was first announced. So this has been sort of a really well accepted and long held principle. This was the norm. You don't go beyond this until now. Now it changes. Let's see. So, anyways, so why make this change? Why is it important to make this change? Why do we need to do this now? Well, the guy who headed the commission, who put out this new report, is a researcher, a professor from Britain. His name is Robin Lovell Badge, and he wrote an article explaining why we had to come up with this new set of rules. And he said, over the past 5 years, we've been able to keep embryos alive, embryo zygotes. We've been able to keep embryos alive longer than we thought possible. We can actually keep them longer than the 14 days. Well, okay. So in other words, the rule was 14 days when we couldn't go past it because we just couldn't succeed in making an embryo live in the lab that long. It was impossible for us to do. But now, until that was a very convenient rule. We couldn't have broken the rule if we wanted to. But now, because there's this, striking research, we could do something that was no longer, once it was not even thought possible. Well, then now we've got to change the rule. Because we can do it, now we can. So there really is no rule. There is no rule. The only rule is what you're capable of doing, what's possible and what's not possible based on your current capabilities. It's not a rule. It's not based in truth. It's not based in morality. It's not based in anything other than, if the rules of society are, you're allowed to do whatever you can do, Well, then, if I'm stronger than the next guy and I can go up and I can punch his face out because I'm stronger than him, well, since I can do it, then I'm allowed to do it. There's no rule there. There's no morality there. And is that not similar to what we're talking about? You can certainly, you take a 14-day-old embryo. I mean, yeah, you can certainly do whatever you want with it. You can kill it. It's defenseless. You can do this. Also, he said, hey, more striking is the creation of animal-human chimeras. Now, remember in 2016, this was listed as a prohibited practice if you're doing it, for breeding purposes. But now, hey, most striking. Now he's writing now in 2021. Most striking is the creation of animal-human chimeras by injecting cells from one species into an early-stage embryo from another species. This might enable, for example, a pig to produce a human heart. Where is anything resembling the truth? I mean, if in fact the 2016 rule where this was prohibited was talking about something else than what he's talking about now in 2021, that this kind of experimentation in the lab, if it's not designed for breeding purposes, then that's not prohibited. That's okay, and that this experimentation in the lab. But he's talking about a pig to produce a human heart. Is that not breeding in some sense? Crossbreeding in some sense? Where does it stop? And if that's what we think in 2021, what about 2026? What about 2031? I mean, is there any reality? Is there any truth at all? What's okay? What's not okay? He says, now here's a cute one. He says, scientists want clear boundaries. That's why they needed to make this report, so that they could explain to scientists what's okay to do with stem cell research and what's not. So scientists want clear boundaries. But then he said, in past guidelines, in his very same article, again, inconsistencies galore. In the very same article, in past guidelines, the ISSCR recognized 3 broad categories of experiment: banned, permitted with dedicated review and oversight, and permitted generally. Now we have added nuance to these categories. We suggest that certain types of research, such as allowing animals with human gametes to breed. Oh, excuse me. If I was unclear myself as to whether or not they're reversing this policy from 2016, he's writing it right. There's no mistaking. So this business about mixing humans and animals, verboten prohibited in 2016, it's okay now. Such as So now we've added nuance to these categories. We suggest that certain types of research, such as allowing animals with human gametes to breed, should not be permitted at all because they are ethically concerning, lack compelling scientific rationale, of both. Other kinds are not permitted now, but might be one day. So they suggest that these categories of breeding might be concerning. They should not be permitted because they might be ethically concerning. We suggest that. Now, of course, in 2016, they said prohibited, period. Now, we suggest it might not because they are ethically concerning. And then in the very next sentence, he says, things might not be permitted now, but might be one day. This is adding nuance, as he says. Well, I thought scientists wanted clear rules. How can you know? Yeah, and if you're only concerned about, how can you know what you're doing is okay or not? And if your only concern is whether it's okay in this day, whether it is legal, whether it's accepted in your professional community as meeting an ethical standard, so if it breaches or doesn't breach an ethical rule, if that's only your concern, then maybe this is okay. Because you can't do something in 2016, but in 2021 you can. But that's okay because the ethical standards for our professional community have changed. And all I'm concerned with is following the rules. But what about, is it right or is it wrong? Why do we even have these so-called ethical standards? Aren't they because we're supposed to decide whether we're supposed to try to abide by what's right and wrong? What about your own internal morals? What about your own internal conscience? None of that even matters if this can change from day to day? He says that in coming up with the 2021 standards, they've consulted relevant polls. Well, that's great. That's great. We're going to now discern truth by looking our finger and sticking it up in the wind. There is no truth. There is no truth. If you're going to base it on polls, it's not truth at that point. Interestingly enough, he says that now they think it's okay to go from 14 to 28 days. So this hard and fast, this widely accepted rule of 14 days now becomes 28. Even though before it was 14 because, hey, you form the spinal cord and you form the nervous system, now we can go to 28, even after that. So do we have a human? Do we have something that can start to feel pain? Doesn't matter. The reason for this is that in normal pregnancies, processes for fetal development can start to go awry during this critical period between 14 and 28 days. So we have to study this important period of time. I mean, really? Is he kidding? He talks about preventing miscarriages. We need to do this research to prevent miscarriages. Well, why are we worried about that? We don't want to lose a human life. But we're going to do this research where we kill embryos all the time. And does this not make sense only to me? How is it that this doesn't dawn on these people that, if you're going to try to prevent miscarriages by killing embryos, that there's something inconsistent with that? So anyway, I mean, basically I guess the difference is with an embryo in the lab, we don't want that person. With a miscarriage, well, that's a bad thing because the person didn't want that baby to be terminated. So it's a question of whether we want the baby or not. It's only a question of what we want. That's our new truth. He talks about now that if you're going to go up to this 28-day period, well, you should submit a proposal, and then you should have peer review, and people should, weigh in and give their input on whether or not you should be allowed to do it. So, in other words, no clear standard, none. Scientists want clear standards. We're throwing those out the window. But why should each proposal be judged on a case? He says each proposal to do this should be judged on an individual basis. So again, no rule, no clear lines. Scientists want clear lines. We're not going to have them. But why do we do this? Why are we going to judge these things on a case-by-case basis? We're going to do this to determine whether the research is justifiable in terms of the information obtained, whether the research is justifiable. Justifiable as opposed to what? Wouldn't all research be justifiable? Why would the research not be justifiable? He's admitting that there's a problem with destroying embryos after a certain point in time. Whether it's justifiable. Why would it be unjustifiable? Because there's a value to the embryo? If there's no value to the embryo, anything's justifiable. All of it's justifiable. It doesn't make sense. To just use the word justifiable is admitting something in one place that he's going to be denying in another. And they don't even see this. He said the more embryos that would be used, or the longer that they would be kept in culture, the higher the bar. So when you're going to submit these proposals and then your peers are going to review them and weigh in on them, the bar to do research past the 14 days is going to be higher. The more embryos that you submit in your proposal you need to use. Why? Who cares? Why should the number of embryos matter? Oh? The embryos are important? Really? But we can kill them? Somebody would have, I would hate to be a lawyer trying to defend, I'm a lawyer by trade, to defend this position. Because over and over and over again, you're arguing one thing at one point and then arguing the very opposite the next. We have added nuance. There's no purpose for this. There's, the concept of justifiable. And if you're going to judge these proposals, if you're going to have peer review for these proposals, what is going to be justifiable? What standards are you going to use? What criteria are you going to employ? Why is something justifiable and not justifiable? Does that embryo have value? You're going to compare destroying a high number of embryos versus if you're going to try to destroy a high number of embryos for something that's got limited informational value, then you're not going to get approved. It's not going to be justifiable. Doesn't make any sense, though. Because that means an embryo has value. And, of course, everything that this research involves is that the embryos don't have value. If they had value, you couldn't kill them. So interestingly enough, in Canada, there is a recent piece of legislation that was defeated. And it's related to this stem cell question, because stem cell question, this research matter, this new way of, this way of thinking about stem cell research, basically comes down to this. These things, embryos have value, zygotes, embryos have value, or they don't have value on whether we want to give it to them. There's no intrinsic value that they have on their own. If we think it's important then fine, we don't destroy them early. I mean, later. You're going to destroy them anyway, but at least you're not going to destroy them after they start to form, and develop to a certain degree. But that's going to depend on whether we decide the information that we could gain is valuable. We're either going to give that embryo value or not. We decide. Well, in Canada, they had a bill that would ban abortion based on sex selection. It simply said that if a doctor knows that the only reason a person is coming in for an abortion is because they don't want that sex of a baby of that sex, they want it of a different sex, that's not permissible. That was defeated by a vote of 245 to 81, a huge margin. It was defeated. So in other words, you can do this. Let me get this. So, we're pregnant. We wanted a boy. We're getting a girl. Let's get rid of it. If it was a boy, you'd keep it. If it was a girl, you get rid of it. That's okay. That's legal. You can do that. Why? Why is that even allowed? In Canada, a recent poll showed 84% of the people thought that was wrong, thought that should be illegal. But the politicians in Canada said, no, 84% of the people are wrong. So here's another inconsistency for you. If we haven't had enough inconsistencies in all this, how about one more? Why should we stop with, the 10 or, dozen we've had so far? In his justification for changing the standards on stem cell research, this chairman of the committee said, hey, we took polls. We listened to the polls. But on sex-selective abortions, we're not going to listen to the polls. 84%, we don't care. Is there something wrong with this? I mean, if 84%, think there's something wrong with that, then maybe there is, something wrong with it. It doesn't measure up with, just something inside, some basic level of conscience. But the politicians said, no, it's okay. And here's the funny thing. The sponsor of this bill in Canada said of her bill that sex-selective abortion is not permissible in a society that advocates for the equality of the sexes. If you believe in the equality of the sexes, then it's wrong to base abortions on whether or not you want this sex or that sex. Are we not all equal? Or is that just something that we say? We believe in the equality of the sexes sometimes, but then not other times. You don't really believe in the equality of the sexes then if you do. Prime Minister Trudeau wrote on Twitter lamenting the positive votes that went, the positive votes that were cast on this defeated bill. These are the votes that lost, and he was lamenting them. I guess victory isn't enough for him. He said 81 members of the Conservative Party voted in favor of anti-choice legislation today. It is completely unacceptable that they will not support, protect, or defend a woman's right to choose. The sponsor of the bill tweeted a reply, "You don't stand up for baby girls in the womb, equality, or human rights. You don't represent the majority of Canadian women. You represent 16% of Canadians who are pro-abortion anytime for any reason. Shameful." So that's what's happening in Canada. By the way, there was a study that came out in Canada that showed sex selection abortions are taking place. There's a group of people, there's a couple of, not a group, I think two professors in particular. One at St. Michael's Hospital, at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, they studied more than a million births over a decade in the province of Toronto. Anonymous medical records, they were anonymized medical records. And then they compared these findings with abortion records. And they found that at least with one segment, like with Indian-born people, and apparently it's thought that immigrants from India, Indian-born people, they value male offspring more than female offspring. And if an Indian-born mother had two daughters and also had one or more abortions, odds were nearly 70% the third child was a boy. So if they already had two daughters, then had one or more abortions, and then had a third child who was more often than not, to the tune of 77%, almost 8 times out of 10, that child was a boy. Had abortions before, but now with the third child just happened to be a boy. So we're selecting people. So women aren't as valuable. Women are not as valuable. We don't want them. If I've got a baby that's going to be a girl, I can get rid of it. It's not a question of, hey, is it going to put a strain on the financial resources of the mother so that they're going to end up being poverty-stricken with too many kids? It's not because the mother is too young and is not ready to have her life changed by the responsibilities of being a parent. It's not any of the reasons that people usually use to support a woman's right to choose. It's a right to choose, I don't like girls, or I don't like boys, perhaps, in some cases, depending. That's the right to choose. I like and I don't like. That's the right to choose. Is there a rule here? Is there a truth here? Is there something that matters here? No. It's either we want or we don't want. Same as with the stem cell research issue. There was a prior time when this sort of thing made sense. There's a famous case in the United States back before slavery was illegal, back before the Civil War. It was called the Dred Scott decision. And the majority opinion, written by the Chief Justice Argentini, said, the question is simply this, and I'm going to use words that were written in the some of these words we wouldn't use today, but they were written in the opinion, so we're going to recite them. Because we believe in historical accuracy and not rewriting history. The question is simply this. Can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed to the citizens? So it's a very straightforward question. Can a, quote, Negro become a citizen? And the decision said no. A majority of the Supreme Court said no, couldn't. It said the situation, by the way, it's interestingly enough, it said the situation for this population, the black population, was altogether unlike that of the Indian race, Native American Indians. Because as far as the Indians, although they were uncivilized, they were yet a free and independent people. So let me understand the reasoning here. Because black slaves in this country were not free and independent, they were different from Native American Indians. Of course, the reason that they were not free was because they were forced to be that way against their will. So you get penalized twice. Does it make sense? Is this logical? No, of course not. It's inconsistent? Yes. Is it another example of illogic and twisted reasoning to support positions that don't make sense? Yes. Same thing with the stem cell people and the same-sex abortions. Just inconsistencies galore. It's just, if you could find one inconsistency, one illogical thing where somebody was, not contradicting an argument made by somebody else, but contradicting an argument they themselves make. If you found that they did that once, that should be enough of an accusation against them to say, you don't know what you're talking about. Or I don't have to believe you. I don't have to follow what you're selling because, this is broken logic. But to find a dozen or more, it's absurd. And yet, we maintain these positions. Our people in the scientific community, people who believe these positions, maintain them despite all of this flawed reasoning. It's only because they want to, not because they're being objective in their thinking. The majority said that the Native American Indians could take up their abode if a Native American Indian decided to leave a reservation and take up his abode among the white population. He would be entitled to all the rights and privileges which would belong to an immigrant from any other foreign people. So just like you immigrated from Britain or Italy, Ireland, Germany, whatever, hey, you could be a citizen. Well, if you're Native American Indian, same story. But if you happen to immigrate from Africa against your will, no. Is there any logic in that? Is there any cruelty in that? Is there any inhuman barbarism in that? Oh yeah, plenty of that. It goes on, but there's really not much reason to recite more of what they said. Now there was a dissenting opinion in that case by Justice Curtis, and among the things he said is, he says, look, if you follow the line of reasoning that the majority on the court followed, he said, in effect, this is a question about whether the Constitution has empowered Congress to create privileged classes who alone can be entitled to the powers of citizenship. So he called it flat out. This is simply about whether or not you can set up certain categories of people that were allowed to have certain privileges and certain categories of people who aren't. You get to decide. We like this group. We don't like that group. Is it really any different than the stem cell thing? Well, we like this group if it's less than 14 days, but not if it's over 14. And we don't like that group. Of course, that was in 2016. Now that's different. And who knows what it's going to be again a few years from now. We create groups. And of course, you create groups in terms of sex-selective abortions. Well, we don't. It's a girl. We don't like that. So, boom. You don't live. But then the Justice Curtis goes on. He says, if you allow this, he said, you must at the same time admit that you're giving the government unlimited power. The federal government, if this is true, the federal government may select classes of persons who alone can be entitled to certain privileges. If this power exists, what person born within the states may be president or vice president or hold any office or enjoy any privilege whereof citizenship of the U.S. is a necessary qualification, because that would depend solely on the will, or the whim, I would say, of Congress. He talks about the fact that this involves controlling the political condition of people. You control whether or not they're going to have rights. You can select classes of people who are allowed to have rights, and the government can select other classes of people that will not. That is, in fact, absolute power. You are deciding the level of enjoyment that people can have with their lives. They can have certain privileges in society or not. The privilege even being whether or not they're even free. That was the thinking 150 years ago. He's absolutely right. This power is absolute. You're controlling people. And now we've extended it. Now it's not just controlling who can live free or not. Now it's who's going to die or not. Are we on the right track with what we're doing? Or would we, or is this, a path that we're taking not consistent with St. Paul? And if so, who's right? Well, St. Paul said, that while he was in the womb, God had a plan for him. If that's so, then there could be a little girl, a little girl in the womb of a pregnant mother who's already got 2 daughters. And if what St. Paul said is true, then God has a plan for that 3rd daughter. But then the parents decide, no, you don't live. Are these two things different? Yes. Who's right? St. Paul or this law in Canada? And who's right? St. Paul or this new policy on stem cell research that God knows where it's going to go in the years ahead? Well, I'll side on the guy who's been around for 2,000 years. I'll side with the guy who believes every life is important. Because when we go down the path of deciding who's important and who's not important, which class is going to have the privilege of living and which isn't, then we're doing everything, we're repeating everything that was wrong with this abysmal, horrid Dred Scott decision. And we're doing it in a modern age when supposedly we're smarter and know better. So things change and things don't change. The problems don't change. We don't learn from the past. Whether it's 150 years ago or 5 years ago, we do what we want. But I'll take the guy who's been around for 2,000 years and preaches that everybody is important. Well, in any event, that has been this has been another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. We hope that you found it perhaps even a little interesting, perhaps provocative. We hope you'll join us again. And until the next time, God bless.
The mission of Holy Apostles College and Seminary is to form faithful witnesses of Christ. Year after year, the prestigious Newman Guide has recommended Holy Apostles for our academic excellence and steadfast fidelity to the magisterial teachings of the Catholic Church. We are also fully accredited and the leader in Catholic online learning. Our students enjoy the unsurpassed flexibility to study on their own time and anywhere in the world through asynchronous engagement. Holy Apostles is dedicated to the relentless pursuit of truth, which allows students in all academic programs, including undergraduate, graduate, and personal interest, to formulate a coherent worldview based on both faith and reason. The study of the liberal arts also develops and refines key competencies associated with career readiness, such as critical thinking and problem solving, clear communication, collaboration, and a strong work ethic. The tuition rate at Holy Apostles is one of the most affordable in the country. Yearly tuition for a full-time undergraduate is under $12,000. Students at Holy Apostles can graduate with minimal or even no college debt, which enables them to live out their calling as faithful witnesses of Christ without heavy financial burdens holding them back. Please visit www.holyapostles.edu/admissions for more information. The Fall 2021 admissions deadline is Friday, July 23rd. Classes start Monday, August 30th. See you soon.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.